Welcome to a new episode of Context is King. I'm Eric, joined as always by Ash. How you doing, Ash?
Very good.
So we're back after a 2-week hiatus.
Correct.
We started in New York, and we did some pretty cool stuff there. You want to talk about our New York trip?
Yeah, so basically we were in New York to conduct a handful of interviews with New York-based entrepreneurs, founders, builders, and we interviewed 3 people.
Namely?
Anthony Scaramucci, Rich Antoniello of Complex, and Rafat Ali of Skift, formerly Paid Content. And, you know, you might think those are 3 very different individuals,
But there is a common thread, right?
Yeah, I would say for some time now I've wanted to start a series talking to builders, not necessarily only entrepreneurs or CEOs, but basically people who, you know, have a concept and then turn it into reality. And you're going to say, okay, I get Rich from Complex and Rafat from Skift, but then you got to remember that Anthony Scaramucci, the Mooch, before his insane 11 days as White House Director of Communications, he actually not only, after leaving Harvard, went to Goldman, got fired, got hired again, but then he left Goldman Sachs to launch 2 very successful hedge funds. And it's funny because when he was in the news, I actually kind of researched him a little bit to go like, who's this guy? I'd kind of heard about him over the years. He also launched a conference called SALT. But on LinkedIn, his profile says entrepreneur. So when I had this idea for this series called The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, I reached out to him and we exchanged some thoughts, and he was gracious enough to sit with us. And you'll be seeing those pretty soon, and we'll be featuring them. I think what we might do is feature like the unedited, long, complete sequence more as a podcast type, and then publish like a 30, 40-minute more tight, condensed, version. Can
I say what the comparable is? Is it, we talked about it's a little bit like comedians in cars getting coffee, but for entrepreneurs.
Yeah, it is. And what's funny is when I asked Rich to come on from Complex, I had seen, obviously, Hot Ones, but I had not seen the blueprint.
And this is very much like the blueprint.
And when I said it to him, he's like, yeah, he's like, exactly, you would think, eh? It's like, but I still do the interview because I like you. So I felt the one with Rich was probably, hopefully, the most emblematic, symbolic of what the series is going to look like, where we don't just talk about the latest trends in CPMs, market share, and Facebook. It's a lot about just like the harsh realities of being an entrepreneur, the struggles, the balance. It's a lot of balance between life and work.
And my favorite moment actually is when you were asking him about spoiling his kids or not spoiling, family life. It's interesting to peek behind the curtain at what drives these people, not just in a business sense. The Mooch interview was fascinating to me because we get a sense of the Mooch, his persona. And he is very much like his persona, but there was a lot more to the
Yeah, look, I think the Mooch one, the feedback was amazing. The people in the room really seemed to like it. The interviews themselves really liked it. Rich emailed me, was like, this was amazing, I had a great time. And yeah, I think with the Mooch, I personally would have wanted to talk a little bit less about the politics, but he was on fire. He was on fire, and the conversation went towards that. Look, and if you take a step back, I've spent 20 years since graduating college with a degree in business, swerving into media. I've spent 20 years in digital media, and it's been a blast. And, yesterday I turned 40.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. And yeah, I kind of said, look, if I'm going to be running WatchMojo, I think that WatchMojo still has so much opportunity in that kind of brand that is all about fans and what you're nostalgic about, whether it's the Transformers or what you're passionate about, whether it's Game of Thrones, we cover that and we super serve our audience with top 10 lists and verses. And with Talks, we get to go deeper and have a conversation about the crazy moments in Game of Thrones or, why Canada failed to win gold in hockey or whatever you want to talk about. But for myself, as a 40-year-old, I'm never going to be the kind of guy who's going to go sit on a beach. And one of the things we started to do, I didn't call out and say, let's do this. Kind of by nature, once we started Talks, we said, hey, why don't you come on and talk about VidCon and Viacom, which we felt like our audience may care about, and it kind of kept going and going.
Into something.
And then from there, Context is King, which is the first show on this kind of more businessy, business life, I call it, portion of Talks. Then The Good, the Bad, the Ugly is like another show. And then, that's kind of like, I would say, the continued evolution of WatchMojo, the company, where, we will probably be dabbling in this kind of new brand called Context.tv to kind of just, you got to keep your feet moving as an entrepreneur. As a brand, you don't want to go stale or you die.
Now, one thing that Rich said in the interview that I thought was really interesting is that he mentioned the fact that when watching these, you don't pull any punches. And you mentioned the Viacom VidCon discussion. We've talked about Facebook, we've talked about Buzzfeed, we've talked about Vice, and you're not really afraid to call out companies on what they're doing.
Okay, fair enough, and I think you're right. There's two sides to it. I had a meeting in New York when we were there, and one gentleman I met, it's funny, when we sat down to talk business, he actually said, I won't name him, and I think I could share this because it's a general thing. He's like, wait, can I just ask you? He's like, are we here to talk business? And I said, yeah, what else are we here to talk about? He's like, well, you're a reporter, aren't you? And I was like, okay, I don't usually get called a reporter. I do get called worse things. I said, no, I have been a columnist where I've covered the industry. I go, but that's a fair question. I go, unless I'm coming to you, I go, the default when I approach you is we're talking business, assume it's confidential. I go, if I ever approach you to do a story, whether it's for our own publication or as back in the day, Media Post or TechCrunch, I will say I'm approaching you first and foremost in a media capacity to cover this. But if ever in a private conversation you say something funny or witty, I'll just ask you, I go, can I use that? And you could say yes, no, on the record or off the record. But yeah, so it's not so much I don't pull any punches or not, it's that I don't feel like the audience gets as much value if I don't share, kind of my wartime experiences in the trenches. So I do keep a lot confidential, right? I know in a follow-up segment we're going to talk about Vice, which may or may not have a new CEO. I'm going to share some stuff that I feel is not confidential, doesn't violate anybody's trust, but that is interesting to the viewership. I'm not suicidal, but to Rich's point, look, I don't have an outside board. I'm not looking to sell the business tomorrow. I don't necessarily feel like I'm doing anything that's crazy. I'm just kind of sharing the experiences that I've had. And frankly, the feedback from the audience and, whether it's people in New York, people who've been writing, I spoke in Miami last week, the people were extremely reacting well to it. So I kind of feed off the energy of what people like. If people say, yeah, we don't like this, I'll kind of take that into consideration. And it's not that shocking because WatchMojo itself is a user-driven community, right? People suggest ideas, we consider them, and then we decide to do them or not.
But so you mentioned Miami. You just came back from Miami, you celebrated your 40th birthday, and you also posted something on LinkedIn yesterday that was about what a difference 5 years makes.
Yeah, so 5 years ago, we were coming back from Miami as well. Growing up, for some reason, I always had this misguided, naive thing of I want to retire at 35, which makes no sense because today I realize I probably don't want to retire ever. But so I decided, I was in no position to retire. The company had finally broken even in 2011 or 2012. We were doing well. The WatchMojo kind of brand that kind of covered top 10s had started to take off. And realistically, I felt like I feel the spark. This is going to go somewhere. But at that moment, we probably had a couple 100,000 subscribers. And we had been courted by a company in Dallas called Belo that wanted to acquire WatchMojo. And initially I was like, what do they see in us? But they kind of needed to place some bets in digital. And as much as I felt in my gut as an entrepreneur that we should not sell, that it was premature, I felt like, you know what, it's been 6, 7 years, these guys are gonna come, it won't be FU money, but it's a good sum to get, it gives stability to the team. And I really, really didn't want to sell, but I felt it was the right, safe thing to do. And then lo and behold, 5 years ago when I was getting into the airport, From Miami, the gentleman that was leading the talks, a fine lad named Tyler Martin, he called me and he said, okay, we're going to be moving ahead with the term sheet. It was bittersweet because I was like, great, can't wait for it. And then a month later, on April 1st, they said, they sent in the term sheet, and then a couple months later, they said, we can't do the deal because we're selling ourselves to Gannett.
Which was another company that had been interested in
we had just talked to Gannett. It was more partnership before. But the irony of all ironies is I was just so relieved. So yesterday at the airport, I was like, wow, sometimes in our conversation with Rich, I said, what's the one deal you didn't make that you're relieved because some of the best deals are the ones you don't make? And even though I love Tyler and I thought Belo was a fine company, thank God we didn't make that deal because just think of the epic run we've had over the past 5 years.
Yeah, 20 million subscribers, up from a couple of 100,000 5 years ago, right? Not a bad place to be.
No, but I think the key is not so much to say, oh my God, we figured it out. It's really you got to keep evolving, otherwise you die.
Context remains king. Thanks very much, Ash. You guys stay posted. We've got lots more, and we'll talk to you soon.